Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Outcry. Tonight, the 10 most terrifying true road trip horror stories will transport us through the back roads and highways of North America. These are first-person stories from travelers who traveled in quest of freedom and adventure, only to end up in terrifying circumstances that transformed their dream vacations into actual tragedies. From the snow-covered roads of Canada to the desolate areas of the American Southwest and the winding country roads of the United Kingdom, each tale captures an actual experience of those who did not survive. Stories of unexplained supernatural experiences abound. Encounters with frightening individuals who prey on lone travelers and mysterious events that make it hard to tell what is real and what is not. These are not urban legends or campfire tales that have been passed down through the ages. These are true stories from real people who discovered that the most terrifying monsters are not hidden in our closets or under our beds, but rather wait along the very roads that carry us home. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Midnight Outcry for daily real horror content that will leave you wondering about every shadow and odd face you encounter. Press that notification bell to make sure you never miss the call of darkness. Fasten your seatbelts and lock your doors as we travel down 10 of the most terrifying roads in the world, where one wrong turn could send you straight to hell. In the winter of 2018, rural Manitoba's roads were hazardous and slick. Marcus Thompson had worked a late shift at the factory and was driving home alone. Only the yellow glow of his headlights could be seen piercing the blizzard that followed. And the world outside was a uniform white as the severe snowstorm began. The storm had begun as the land was turning to dusk. Marcus was used to driving in bad weather because he grew up in Canada's harsh winters. But tonight was different. The howl of the wind like a banshee and the snow's firm hold on trees and power lines drowned out all sounds except the crunch of his tires on the compacted snow. At about 11 p.m., Marcus turned a long curve outside a small town and saw a man standing beside the road, barely visible through the veil of snow. The woman's dark hair was blown into her face, and she was wearing a big coat. At first, he thought she might be trying to hitch a ride. The storm was getting stronger, and he knew she wouldn't be able to survive long out here without help. Marcus cautiously pulled over in the tight shoulder, slowed, and lowered his window. "You need a ride," he yelled, trying to be heard over the roaring storm. The woman nodded, looking shivering and pale. "Hop in. I will take you wherever you need to go," Marcus said, unlocking the passenger door. She hurried inside with unsteady hands and shut the door. Marcus brought her an additional blanket from the back seat, and she wrapped it tightly around herself. The cold she had been feeling was a stark contrast to the warmth of the car. With the defroster fighting the icy windshield, Marcus looked over and asked, "Where are you headed?" "I can get off at Rosecrans exit," she said in a barely audible whisper, "just down the highway." Marcus nodded and began to merge back onto the road. For the next 20 minutes, the only sounds were the intermittent howling of the wind and the hum of the engine. Marcus took several quick looks at the woman. She was otherworldly. Her eyes were brilliantly bright, almost glowing in the dim light. Still, a deep sadness marked her face. She hesitated, then answered quietly when Marcus finally tried to break the silence by asking, "Are you okay?" "I'm just cold." Marcus nodded sympathetically. "You should have asked for help sooner. This storm is deadly out here." "I couldn't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Marcus could ask any more questions, the fuel light on the car flicked on. "Is your gas tank empty?" he muttered. "Is there a gas station nearby?" "There's one up ahead, a few miles off the highway," she said. Marcus's phone's screen flickered wildly when he pulled it out. The storm was clearly interfering with the transmission. He tapped Siri. "Where is the nearest gas station?" the voice asked immediately. "All right, that should do," Marcus said, and he headed for the exit ramp. The snow continued to fall, and the highway was deserted. There is a gas station 20 minutes away, accessible via the upcoming exit onto US 15. Marcus decided to turn to face his friend as he slowed toward the corner. His heart stopped pounding. The seat was empty. Not a blanket. No sign that anyone had been there. He glanced down at his lap and saw that the blanket he had given her was still folded neatly on the back seat. He blinked hard once, twice, but the woman was truly gone. His pulse quickened as he peered around in the glare of the headlights, but there was no one moving in the snow. No tracks, no movement, just the relentless storm. He immediately locked the doors, which had not been unlocked since he had picked her up. His mind was racing. Was this some kind of hallucination? Had he finally succumbed to exhaustion while traveling? Even as the cold crept into the car, Marcus felt a rush of heat that was equal parts horror and disbelief. He gripped the steering wheel and forced himself to continue toward the gas station. When he pulled in, the bright fluorescent lights seemed almost unnatural after the darkness of the storm. Aside from a few parked cars, it was nearly deserted. The clerk looked up at Marcus sleepily as he placed his coffee order inside. He drank and tried to relax, then approached a man in a bulky jacket who was outside pumping gas. "You willing to spare a minute, friend?" shouted Marcus, and the man nodded and stepped forward. As he related the strange story of how he had picked up a woman on the road and she had suddenly disappeared from his car, Marcus swallowed hard. The man listened intently, his eyes narrowing. When Marcus finished, the man sighed deeply. The man said, "You probably picked up the vanishing hitchhiker." "The what?" Marcus asked incredulously, as the man related a local legend about a woman who died in a fatal accident on that particular stretch of highway more than 20 years ago. During the winter, no one who drove those routes claimed to have seen her. A person who unexpectedly appears in the snow and requests a ride before abruptly and mysteriously vanishing. Most people ignore her, the man said, but some try to help. Very few people escape unharmed. Marcus shuddered not only from the cold, but also from the unresolved fear that sat in his chest. He got back in the car and tried to forget the encounter. When he finally started the engine to drive home, his mind was racing with questions. That woman was who? What had she done for him that night? Was it a ghost, a warning, or something else? The 30-minute drive back seemed to go on forever as the rain persisted. His eyes kept wandering to the passenger seat, half expecting to see her sitting there quietly, staring out at the endless, dark snow. Marcus vowed never to pick up a hitchhiker again. Months later, he still told the story to friends and coworkers in the factory. The memory was as clear as if it had just happened. There were unavoidably icy and unanswered questions in every recounting. After that night, Marcus would sometimes see strange frost-like patterns on the passenger glass that looked vaguely like a woman's face, which he would then wipe away with a hand that was shaking. He never saw the woman again. Although he was able to escape her eerie presence, the hitchhiker's disappearance lingered in his mind like a frozen ghost during the lengthy drive home. As the snowstorm raged into midnight, Marcus did not find comfort in the warmth of his car. Other than the faint sounds of tires on snow and wind, the silence was intolerable, and the only sound coming from the radio was static. Out of the corner of his eye, he would sometimes catch a glimpse of something, a hazy shadow barely discernible under the headlights. He fought the growing urge to stop again. He clung tightly to the steering wheel as he navigated the ice turns and winding highway sections. He struggled to solve the haunting mystery of the woman's sudden absence. The image of her face kept coming back to him. The pale skin turned pink from the cold. The lustrous locks of hair froze. The brightness and agony of the eyes were almost unearthly. Marcus tried to focus on the mundane. The gas station attendant had mentioned the vanishing hitchhiker legend, adding that witnesses often described an inexplicable feeling of dread or despair that lingered for a long time. He wondered if that was why she looked so sad and lifeless. He remembered seeing her on the side of the road for the first time. The storm was stronger than usual, and he recalled the bleak landscape, with ice-covered bent trees and a white blanket of snow broken only by the black cracks of frozen earth. He never asked, and the woman never gave her name. She was so delicate, almost ethereal, that Marcus felt a natural desire to protect her and keep her from perish in the icy cold. Then, as if swallowed by the shadows, She vanished as he was starting to settle into the journey. He chastised himself for not being more careful, but there was no logical way to explain this. Was this a real-life instance of regional folklore? Was he carrying a restless soul that desperately needed to be put to rest? Or worse, was he stuck in a nightmare from which he would never escape? Marcus shook his head and focused on the road, but there was no doubting that there was another person in the car. He blinked hard, trying to get rid of the eerie sensation that someone was watching him from the empty passenger seat. Later, the snow thinned, and the storm gradually weakened as he approached the edge of the town. The first signs of civilization, dim street lamps that glowed dimly, provided a small measure of relief. With the headlights still on to illuminate the thicket of trees beyond, Marcus finally turned into his driveway and exhaled the cold air. He shut off the engine but kept the doors closed. The sudden silence outside revealed what he dared not say aloud. For nights after that, he dreamed about the woman. In these dreams, she called him to come with her out of the shadows, so that he could understand the grief she could not abandon. A few weeks later, Marcus decided to spend a winter morning at the local library. Buried among fading newspapers and archives, he found the story that would unlock the mystery. 20 years prior, on the same road where Eleanor Grace had been killed in a car accident, Marcus had found her. She had been returning home from a visit with relatives. They were caught off guard by a sudden snowfall, much like the one Marcus drove through. According to reports, Eleanor's car veered off the highway and struck a ditch. The neighborhood was rocked by the incident, and assistance arrived too late. Since then, many motorists have recounted tales of a ghostly woman in a long coat who would show up on the side of the road during blizzards, ask for a ride home, and then vanish while driving. Marcus read every eyewitness report he could find, feeling a strange connection to those who had felt Eleanor's restless spirit. In addition to gaining closure, he also grew to appreciate the mysterious forces that sometimes pass by our fragile planet. He returned home that day with a newfound respect for the stories that linger on quiet storms and old roads. Even though Marcus never again picked up a hitchhiker, ghostly or otherwise, he took Eleanor's story with him as a reminder that some journeys are never truly completed. Emma Sheffield had always loved road trips, especially those that took her into the vast countryside and away from the bustling cities of the United Kingdom. In April 2019, she set out on what was intended to be a leisurely solo trip through Yorkshire, drawn by the promise of tranquil village life and blossoming countryside. Her GPS had guided her through the winding country roads, but as she moved further away from civilization, the usual signs began to fade. The small screen blinked and then blacked out, leaving her stranded with nothing but an old paper map and a failing sense of direction. Emma chose to follow her instincts rather than rely on technology. She was confident she could find the next town with ease, but as dusk was drawing near, she ended up turning off onto a narrow, unmarked path that was encircled by thick trees. The road in front of her continued indefinitely, flanked by dense forest. The ancient branches twisted overhead, creating a black canopy that absorbed the rest of the light. As she reduced her speed and tried to navigate the increasingly treacherous road, the temperature dropped, and an awkward silence engulfed her car like a suffocating blanket. The only sounds to break the stillness were the crunch of dirt beneath her tires and the strange crack of old wood in the wind. As the road appeared to lead her deeper into a remote part of the world, Emma's uneasiness grew. The trail ended suddenly, abruptly at a tall set of gates, iron, old and rusted, with strange symbols she couldn't make out. The metal piece was intricate but eerie, with twisted designs that seemed to move in her peripheral vision. She could make out patches of dark buildings and flashes of light beyond the gates. Curiosity drove Emma to overcome caution. She parked on the side of the road as she approached the imposing entrance, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and excitement. A small side gate stood open, seemingly inviting her inside. It creaked loudly as she pushed it open, the sound echoing through the quiet. She was chilled to the core by what she saw inside. Tall stone walls with jagged coils of wire on top that glowed menacingly in the darkness encircled the vast estate. There were a few buildings in the small village, but the atmosphere was grim and oppressive, with a silence that spoke of terror rather than peace. The fog of dusk mixed with smoke from invisible chimneys, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. Figures moved slowly through the compound, like shadows given shape. Their features were wan and unsmiling, and their modest, uniform attire appeared to have been designed to obliterate any trace of individuality or personality. Emma cautiously made her way through the community, acutely aware that she was completely out of place among these seemingly captive people. The inhabitants avoided eye contact and kept their gazes fixed firmly on the floor, as though afraid to acknowledge her presence. She reached out to a woman raking leaves beside a doorway, hoping to get directions back to civilization. But the woman only mumbled a desperate warning, her eyes wide with barely contained dread. "Go!" the woman shouted. Many guards patrolled the winding streets between buildings, saying, "Before they see you, before it is too late." They were burly men, with cold, calculating eyes, dressed in black uniforms. Locals fled like frightened animals, as their mere presence was enough to cut off all communication. Emma immediately dropped her head in obedience as she felt one guard's hard gaze latch onto her, out of fear of drawing unwanted attention to herself. Her unease increased as she crossed the compound in silence and overheard brief bursts of gloomy and hopeless whispered conversations. In whispers, the residents talked about rules, fines, and the terrible consequences of breaking them. Prematurely aged and with sunken eyes, children clung to their mothers' skirts. Through a dirty window, she saw a group of children huddled in a cold, filthy room. They sat motionless on wooden benches, their heads lowered in perfect harmony, their faces expressionless. A young girl caught Emma's attention. A 7-year-old kid clutching a worn-out, threadbare doll. The child's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and her quiet cry for help was audible. Emma's heart ached at the sight. Her instincts urged her to comfort these suffering children, but the harsh reality of her situation weighed heavily on her. She was isolated, outnumbered, and completely exposed to whatever malevolent powers controlled this world. Footsteps suddenly heavy, menacing, deliberate. A tall, broad-shouldered, majestic man emerged from the shadows between two buildings. His presence seemed to drain the warmth from the air. The unusual, frightening intensity of the burning in his eyes made Emma's skin crawl. Emma stammered, her words caught in her throat as he asked, "What are you doing here, stranger?" His cold, threatening voice cut through the night air like a sword. The man's keen eyes lingered on her face, scrutinizing her with the intensity of a predator assessing potential prey. He seemed to be thinking about what she had said, searching for deceit or hidden agendas. "I got lost. My GPS died, and I was trying to find my way back to the main road. I did not mean to intrude." The silence between them was heavy, with danger that was not spoken. "This is not a place for outsiders," he finally said, his tone blatantly menacing. "Privacy and loyalty are very important in our community." "You have seen things that weren't meant to be seen." Emma experienced a chilling surge of fear. She realized suddenly that she had ventured into a much darker area than the usual rural one. This was a prison disguised as a sanctuary, and she had just come to light as a potential threat to their carefully guarded secrets. Without another word, she turned on her heel and ran toward her car, her feet stomping on the sand. Behind her, she could hear the man's heavy boots pursuing, shouts, and the sound of gates being unlocked. The symphony of danger created by other voices joining the chase inspired her to continue. After frantically fumbling with her keys, she managed to unlock her car and jump inside after hearing the compound gates creak open behind her. With trembling hands, she turned on the engine, and it roared to life with merciful reliability. As Emma drove away from the facility, gravel spraying behind her wheels, she looked in the rearview mirror. Standing silhouetted against the brightness of the compound's lights, she saw the same woman who had warned her earlier, a ghostly figure watching her escape from atop a small hill. The woman's posture conveyed relief and jealousy, as if she wished she could also get out of that terrible place. Emma couldn't stop thinking about the haunting images of the property and the oppressive quiet for weeks afterward. Her sleep was interrupted by nightmares of white faces, pleading children, and the sound of heavy footsteps as they followed her down endless hallways. The next day, Emma called the local police in a desperate attempt to get answers and help the people she had left behind. Officers who inspected the area she described in detail found nothing but an overgrown field, as if the compound had never been there. The locals she spoke with shared vague rumors of an old cult that had supposedly existed in the area decades ago, but none of them claimed to have any specific knowledge of the cult's current existence. Emma struggled to reconcile her vivid, horrific experience with the apparent lack of any evidence. Doubt began to creep in. Had she just forgotten about the whole thing? But the spooky images of those pale faces, the frightened kids, and that frightful man were still fresh in her mind. Determined to find answers, she began researching enigmatic symbols, historical religious sects, and stories of unexplained disappearances associated with remote parts of Yorkshire. The deeper she delved into the region's turbulent past, the more disturbing connections she found. One evening, while browsing the digital newspaper archives at the local library, she discovered horrifying rumors about a clandestine cult that had existed for decades and was known only as the Sable Congregation. According to these old publications, the group had isolated themselves in a covert complex in the Yorkshire countryside, where they were compelled to adhere to a rigid code of silence and fully obey their charismatic but autocratic leader. The historical reports mentioned forced indoctrination, the mysterious disappearance of members who questioned the leadership, and a vast underground network of supporters who helped keep the cult's darkest secrets hidden from the public. Emma shuddered as she read these stories, realizing the awful reality she had inadvertently learned during her tragic road trip. She was horribly aware that others had not been as lucky as she had been, despite the fact that her narrow escape had been extremely fortunate. Due to recurrent nightmares and growing paranoia, Emma began to steer clear of rural roads entirely and refused to go on any more lonely hikes into the countryside. Nevertheless, despite her precautions, she sometimes caught a glimpse of dark figures watching her from the corners of her eyes in the middle of the night. A terrifying reminder that some tragedies are here to stay. The incident had changed her profoundly, and she now understood the thin line that separates the ordinary world from the unthinkable darkness that lurks just beyond the boundaries of normal civilization. Emma ultimately chose to share her experience, despite her ongoing fear and declining mental health. She believed that exposing the truth, no matter how terrible or unbelievable it may seem, was the only way to shed light into the darkest corners of the world and perhaps spare others from a similar fate. For any travelers who decide to take a detour, her story should serve as a sobering reminder. Getting lost can occasionally place you in the midst of a nightmare from which you may never fully recover. Jake Morrison was a seasoned truck driver from Texas who was used to the wide highways and the loneliness of the open road. Infinite miles, strangers at truck stops, and journeys through cities and deserts that merged into one unrecognizable landscape characterized his life. The job was never easy, and long-haul drivers were the only ones who truly understood the psychological effects of loneliness. One hot July 2020 evening, after a long day of hauling goods through the brutal West Texas desert heat, Jake pulled into a roadside truck stop just outside El Paso. The sun was sinking and orange and red flames were disappearing into the night sky. The air was thick and dry, with heat that seemed to permeate every pore. The parking lot was packed with pickup trucks and semis, and Jake could see other drivers relaxing in folding chairs outside their taxis, talking about their journeys, or simply winding down after a long day. Jake was exhausted, his muscles ached and his throat was dry, but the brief break at the stop was welcome. Fantastic chance to chat with other drivers and even enjoy a cool drink. As Jake maneuvered his rig toward the diner, he noticed a man coming toward him. The man's gentle face had a clear look of curiosity. "Hey, were you at the Walmart in town earlier today?" Jake asked, his brows furrowed in confusion. "No," he shook his head. "I haven't been in Walmart all day." With a smile, the man showed Jake a picture on his phone. Jake's eyes widened in surprise. The picture displayed a man wearing jeans, a casual shirt, and a faded baseball cap sitting outside the Walmart the caller had mentioned. The individual in the photo was holding a can of soda and gazing off into the distance. The man looked exactly like Jake. There was no mistaking it. The truck driver laughed. "You see, I was unaware that you had a twin in El Paso." Jake's stomach tightened into a cold knot, but he forced a tense laugh. Jake knew he had been traveling all day and that the photo was recent. He was certain that he had not left his rig or gone to any stores. According to the timestamp on the photo, it was taken a few hours earlier, when Jake was driving through the desert far from any stores. Lost in his phone and completely oblivious to the turmoil he had just wrought in Jake's mind, the man tapped Jake's shoulder and turned to go. A persistent uneasiness enveloped Jake like a heavy blanket. Over the next few hours, he overheard other drivers making odd comments. Low voices told of a man who looked like him but shared little else. Some said that this doppelganger had an accent that Jake didn't recognize, while others mentioned behaviors and mannerisms that seemed strange for someone who was supposedly Jake's twin. A driver claimed to have seen Jake and the gas station employee argue angrily over a credit card problem. Another said they saw Jake at a local tavern, where he was drinking too much and making a scene. But Jake knew that he had been in his taxi to maintain his professional image and adhere to his strict no-alcohol policy. Jake kept telling himself that it was an exaggeration or a coincidence, but doubt kept nodding at him. Was he losing his sense of reality? Had the isolation and long hours finally taken a toll on his mental health? In order to drown out the noise from the nearby rigs, Jake put on earplugs in his truck that evening. The heat of midday gave way to cool desert air, and the darkness shrouded him like a shroud. A gentle tap on the window roused him from his slumber. He jolted to his feet and peered through the glass, his heart pounding in his chest. A man outside was shadowed by the dim security lights, but he was looking back with a face that was a perfect reflection of the light. The figure wore the same faded denim jacket and baseball cap that he did. The creature smiled, but the expression was cold and unhuman. The eyes, coldness, cunning, and malevolent intelligence sent chills down Jake's spine. Jake hit his head on the steering wheel and slammed the window shut in terror. In his ears, he could hear his heart pounding. Questions were racing through his mind, along with a roiling sense of violation and terror. When he peered out again a few moments later, the figure had vanished, as if it had never existed. The following day, driven by an urgent need for explanation, Jake began to investigate in silence. He carefully questioned other drivers and made covert calls in the tight-knit trucking community. As he dug deeper into the mystery, disturbing tales began to surface. Stories about people who weren't who they said they were. People who disappeared and were later replaced by suspicious imposters who had access to personal data. He conducted his investigation at a dilapidated motel outside of El Paso, where a number of people claimed to have seen his imposter. Jake decided he had no choice but to confront the imposter directly, in spite of the obvious dangers. At twilight, Jake approached the rundown establishment warily, every nerve on edge. The motel was a holdover from decades past, with its peeling paint, broken neon signs, and an atmosphere that spoke of desperation and illegal activity. Through a dirty window, he saw a man lounging in a chair and eating cheap takeout. The man's features were exactly Jake's. The same graying beard, the same aged face, and even the small scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood accident. The imposter looked up suddenly and saw Jake outside. His lips creased in an unsettling sneer, not one of surprise or fear, as he approached the door. Their gazes locked through the glass, and Jake felt as though he was looking into a funhouse mirror where he saw a warped, evil, and frightening reflection of himself. "Who are you?" Jake shouted through the door. The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that were a little different from Jake's. He questioned, "What are you doing with my life?" Straighter, wider, and clearly the product of expensive dental work. "I am you," he said in a voice that was almost but not quite Jake's own. "Only better, more successful, more confident. Everything you could have been if you had made different choices." Jake's stomach churned at the audacity and the implications of those words. Through careful investigation and terrifying confrontations, Jake soon learned that the imposter was part of a sophisticated clandestine network involved in identity theft on a scale he had never imagined. This was far more than simple financial crime. It was a calculated, systematic effort to steal entire lives, complete with reputations, relationships, and futures. His own identity was being hijacked piece by piece. Bank accounts had been opened in his name, insurance policies taken out, and even personal relationships manipulated by people pretending to be him. The network had studied him for months, learning his patterns, his speech, his habits, all to create a more convincing replacement. Jake vowed to reclaim control of his life, plunging headfirst into a shadowy world of deception and danger that existed beneath the surface of normal society. He enlisted the help of law enforcement agencies, sought legal counsel from attorneys who specialized in identity theft cases, and built a support network from those who believed his incredible story. The fight was grueling and often seemed hopeless. At times, Jake feared for his physical safety, as the network made it clear they would go to extreme lengths to protect their operation. He changed his routines completely, monitored his digital footprint obsessively, and guarded his personal information as fiercely as he protected his truck and livelihood. But the psychological terror of realizing a version of himself had been living a separate life, making decisions in his name, and potentially destroying everything he had worked to build left him forever changed. Trust became a luxury he could no longer afford. Days turned into weeks as Jake remained constantly vigilant, aware that the imposter could strike at any moment to reclaim the identity he had stolen. Each roadside stop now carried a shadow of suspicion, and every glance from a stranger raised his hackles. The emotional exhaustion was overwhelming. Jake wrestled with feelings of violation and helplessness that threatened to consume him entirely. But he refused to be defeated by these faceless criminals who saw human lives as nothing more than commodities to be bought and sold. Slowly, through persistence and invaluable help from dedicated officers in the cybercrime unit, Jake began dismantling the network that had stolen his identity bit by bit. Each small victory felt monumental. Each recovered piece of his life a triumph against impossible odds. Finally, after months of investigation and legal battles, the imposter was apprehended during an attempted identity theft of another victim. The relief was overwhelming, but Jake knew the psychological scars would not fade so easily. He had faced a terrifying mirror image of himself and survived to tell the tale, but the experience had fundamentally changed his understanding of personal security and the fragility of identity in the modern world. Jake often found himself pacing his small apartment, replaying every encounter in his mind. Friends and family noticed a change. He was no longer the carefree, easygoing man they once knew. He was haunted, his trust fragmented by the terrifying events he had endured. Sometimes, late at night, he would stare at his reflection, half expecting the imposter to flicker back at him. On one sleepless night, he wrote in his journal, expressing his fear and determination, vowing never to let anyone erase his existence again. "I am Jake Morrison," he wrote with shaking hands, "and no shadow will take that from me." The road had always been his home, but now it was a battleground for his very identity. His warning to others is clear and urgent. Guard your identity fiercely, because sometimes your worst enemy might be wearing your own face. In a world where technology makes identity theft easier than ever, the monsters we should fear most are not hiding in dark forests or abandoned buildings. They are hiding in plain sight, studying us, learning our habits, and preparing to steal everything that makes us who we are. Madison Clark was a Canadian photographer known for her fearless spirit and love of the open road. In early autumn of 2017, she planned a solo journey along the scenic highways of British Columbia, where she hoped to capture the forest's fiery colors and serene mountains. Her trip was meant to be a refreshing escape from the chaos of urban life. She packed lightly, outfitted her car with the camera gear she cherished, and set off with a heart full of anticipation. But from the very first leg of her journey, Madison felt the quiet pulse of something unnatural lurking beneath the beauty. As she drove through winding roads framed by towering evergreens, the serenity was deceptive. On her second night, after capturing vibrant shots of the fall foliage, she made her way toward a small town she had marked as her stopover. Little did she know the journey from which she would never truly escape was about to begin. The night air was crisp as Madison approached the outskirts of the town blanketed in a spectral mist. Her headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the familiar signs she had seen in her research. Yet, something felt off, as though she were entering a place suspended in time. Not quite here, not quite anywhere else. As she navigated the deserted streets, a strange feeling settled in her chest, a weight she could neither explain nor shake. There was no cellular reception, and the radio produced nothing but dead static, further isolating her from the modern world. She parked outside a small motel, the last refuge before hours of empty highway stretched ahead. The motel was quaint, but carried an undeniable aura of melancholy, its neon sign flickering sporadically in the mist. Crossing the threshold into the dimly lit lobby, Madison was greeted by a quiet receptionist who seemed watchful yet distant, almost as if she existed partially in another realm. The woman's eyes held a hollow quality that made Madison's skin crawl. The interior was heavy with the scent of aged wood and faint mildew. Madison settled into her room, unpacked her camera equipment with trembling hands, and attempted to shake the creeping unease that clung to her thoughts like cobwebs. That night, however, sleep was elusive. Whispers filled the darkness outside her window, indistinct but persistent, rising and falling like a tide of tormented voices. She pulled the heavy curtains tight and tried to focus on her breathing, but the sensation only grew stronger. The unmistakable feeling of being watched, followed, and trapped. When dawn finally came, pale and reluctant through the thick forest canopy, Madison vowed to leave the town and the dreadful night behind. But fate had other plans waiting for her on the winding roads ahead. Setting off early, Madison took a familiar highway she had driven multiple times during her research phase. After driving for what felt like barely 20 minutes, the GPS announced a detour due to road construction, a small inconvenience she initially welcomed as a chance to explore new photographic opportunities. Following the satellite navigation system's redirected path, she found herself on a long, narrow road surrounded by dense forest. The ancient trees arching overhead like silent sentinels guarding forgotten secrets. To her growing horror, the detour seemed endless, looping back on itself in impossible ways, with every landmark strangely familiar, yet unsettlingly altered from what she remembered. Hours passed, but the road signs she encountered appeared unchanged from the previous loop. The same weathered gas station appeared again and again, its broken windows reflecting her increasingly panicked face. Time seemed to stretch strangely, as if she were caught in some supernatural snare designed to trap unwary travelers. Each time she reached what she believed was the end of the detour, she found herself back near the same motel town she had fled hours before. The sight of the flickering neon sign filled her with a dread so profound it made her physically ill. Desperate for help, Madison tried to call emergency services, but her phone displayed the mocking message, "No service." No matter where she drove, every attempt to connect to the outside world failed completely, as if some invisible barrier prevented all communication with the real world. Her breath caught as the car radio flickered to life briefly, only to utter cryptic, distorted messages in voices that sounded almost human, but were somehow wrong in ways she could not articulate. The words sent chills down her spine and made her question her own sanity. It became devastatingly clear she was trapped in some supernatural cycle, denied escape, forced to relive the same journey again and again with no hope of breaking free. Fear gave way to exhaustion as Madison's resolve began to waver under the crushing weight of her imprisonment. She began to question reality itself, wondering if her mind was fracturing under the psychological pressure, or if some dark ancient force truly held her prisoner in this nightmarish loop. Days seemed to pass, or was it hours? The sky offered no reliable clues, always cloaked in heavy, unnatural clouds that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life. Time had lost all meaning in this cursed place, she encountered the ghosts of people she vaguely recognized. Fellow travelers caught in the same eternal loop, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow with the despair of countless failed escape attempts. On one particularly terrifying occasion, Madison glimpsed a figure standing motionless in the woods. A young woman with tear-streaked cheeks who beckoned silently with desperate gestures before vanishing into the twisted trees like smoke. The boundary between waking and dreaming blurred until Madison could no longer tell if she were alive, dead, or trapped in some liminal space between worlds. Her grip on sanity grew more tenuous with each passing cycle. In it were a desperate bid for freedom that felt like her last chance. Madison revisited every road, every fractured path, searching methodically for a hidden escape route that might have eluded her previous attempts. Along the way, she kept a detailed journal with shaking hands, documenting every detail, every oddity, and every terrifying encounter, in hopes that understanding the cycle might somehow grant her release from this living hell. Among her frantic notes was the discovery of a long-abandoned chapel hidden deep in the darkest part of the forest, its heavy wooden door standing mysteriously ajar. The building seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy that both terrified and compelled her. Madison felt an inexplicable pull toward the chapel, as if it were the key to breaking the nightmare that had consumed her life. With trembling hands and a heart pounding so hard she could hear it echoing in her ears, she pushed open the massive door and stepped inside the sacred space. The air was thick with dust, and the lingering scent of forgotten prayers and ancient incense. As she explored the chapel with her camera's flash providing the only light, a sudden bone-deep chill enveloped her entire body, and she felt a presence, neither malevolent nor kind, but ancient and eternally watchful. A whisper echoed through the empty pews, indistinct but unmistakably urging her to remember something crucial that lay buried in her subconscious. Memories flashed through her mind like lightning, visions of a tragic female figure trapped eternally in the forest, an act of betrayal that had occurred centuries ago, and a powerful curse binding all who entered this cursed realm to the endless cycle of return and despair. Armed with this newfound knowledge and a fierce determination born of desperation, Madison confronted the supernatural cycle with every ounce of strength she had left. She retraced her steps to the chapel with renewed purpose, performing a complex ritual she had discovered hidden within the cryptic symbols carved into the ancient wooden walls. An old prayer for release that seemed to resonate with power. Brilliant light suddenly poured through the stained glass windows, breaking the oppressive gloom that had shrouded the forest. The crushing weight that had pressed down on her soul began to lift, and the spectral mist that had obscured the world started to dissipate like a retreating nightmare. Exhausted but filled with desperate hope, Madison started her car with trembling hands, and miraculously the GPS signal returned strong and clear. The radio crackled to life with normal stations playing familiar songs. She drove through the forest for hours, the sun rising higher in a clear blue sky, and the world revealed itself anew, with colors more vivid and beautiful than she had ever seen before. Free at last, or so she believed. After escaping the oppressive gloom of the chapel, Madison found herself on a long, empty stretch of road snaking through the forest. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting flickering patterns across the dashboard. It should have been a moment of pure relief, freedom reclaimed, but a growing sense of unease continued to claw at her mind. Her GPS, which had flickered back to life moments earlier, suddenly sputtered again, directing her in familiar circles. The so-called freedom was proving to be nothing more than a cruel illusion designed to torture her with false hope. Hours passed as Madison drove the winding roads, recognizing familiar landmarks in a futile attempt to find a true path out of her supernatural prison. At one point, she came across a small service station, completely deserted, save for a weather-worn sign swinging ominously in the breeze. Inside, she found old newspaper clippings pinned to the wall, yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. They told chilling stories of disappearances, travelers vanishing without a trace along that very route, lost forever in the forest's embrace. The articles mentioned persistent rumors of ancient curses and restless spirits, but all the official reports dismissed the incidents as simple accidents or cases of misadventure. Madison's heart pounded as she pieced together the terrifying truth. The forest and its roads were an elaborate trap, a liminal space between worlds where the living could become lost forever, feeding some hunger she could not comprehend. Night fell again, faster and heavier than before. The shadows grew long and twisted, bending reality in ways that hurt to observe directly. As darkness swallowed the land completely, Madison steered into a narrow clearing where she spotted flickering lights. Other travelers perhaps caught in the same eternal cycle of torment. Faces peered out from behind the twisted trees, pale and anxious, their eyes desperately searching for an escape that might never come. Among them was the young woman Madison had glimpsed days earlier, still silent, but beckoning with urgent desperation, tears streaming down her ghostly cheeks. Madison felt her own resolve ignite like a flame in the darkness. She was no longer alone in this nightmare. Together, perhaps they could find a way to end the cycle that bound them all. The group of lost souls gathered materials, a collection of old books, combined knowledge handed down through fragments of local legends, and whispered secrets passed between the trapped. They planned a dangerous journey back to the chapel, hoping to perform a ritual that would finally sever the ancient curse and open a permanent path home to the world of the living. The trek was perilous, each step more daunting as supernatural forces seemed to actively resist their passage. Shadows shifted in unnatural ways that defied the laws of physics, and disembodied voices whispered constantly to deter them from their mission. Madison's natural leadership sustained the group through the darkest moments, her courage never faltering, despite bone-deep exhaustion and overwhelming fear. When they finally reached the chapel again, they prepared the mystical symbols with painstaking care, arranged forgotten relics according to ancient patterns, and recited prayers meant to awaken powers older than civilization. In a climactic moment that shook the very foundations of reality, the earth trembled violently, and a blinding light more brilliant than the sun shattered the darkness that had held them prisoner. The supernatural loop began to dissolve around them like melting ice. Free from their torment at last, the other travelers found their way back to the world they thought they had lost forever. But for Madison, the curse would prove to be far more tenacious and personal. Yet for Madison, the curse was not so easily broken by collective action. As she attempted to resume her normal life, the supernatural pull of the forest and the cursed roads remained as strong as ever, like invisible chains dragging at her soul. Despite countless attempts to avoid the path and numerous efforts to stay away from British Columbia entirely, she would inexplicably find herself standing at the edge of the same chapel, confronted by the endless journey she thought she had finally escaped. Haunted by the supernatural cycles that seemed to define her very existence, Madison's story has become a quiet legend among seasoned travelers on the British Columbia highways. A cautionary tale and reminder of the thin veil that separates the known world from the realm of the unknown. Her haunting journey echoes an ancient truth that many prefer to ignore. Some roads lead beyond the world we understand, carrying us into places where time bends according to different laws, and escape is never guaranteed. And in the end, Madison learned that sometimes the only way forward through supernatural torment is to accept that you must keep returning to face what cannot be left behind. Oliver Davies had grown up with stories of his sprawling Welsh family, cousins in farmhouses, distant aunts who knitted by the fire, and elders who traced their bloodlines back hundreds of years through the green valleys and stormy coasts of Wales. Yet, orphaned as a teenager and moved to London for work, he had not seen any of them in decades. It was a surprise then when a formal-look letter arrived at his apartment in the spring of 2017. It was heavy with a scent of lavender and the dust of long travel embossed with an old crest reading day. Inside was a handwritten invitation: the Davies family reunion, Saturday, June 12th. Binmore Hall, Carmaneer. You are family. It is time to come home. Oliver turned the envelope over in his hands for days. He could not quite recall the connections, but a warmth grew within him. Perhaps he had family after all, people who might know his roots and where he came from. He booked a rental car, took time off work, and set off for Karen with equal parts hope and anxiety, imagining stories swapped over bread and beer, hugs and revelations. The journey was beautiful. Sheep among lush rolling hills, stone bridges crossing mirror-smooth rivers, crows swirling above ancient ruins. As he neared the destination, the lanes became narrower, the hedge rose taller, and the air heavier. Yet he was greeted with bursts of sun after rain, golden valleys shivering in the breeze. A faded sign appeared out of the mist, Binmore Hall, with a painted family crest. Oliver's heart thumped with anticipation as he followed the gravel drive winding between yew and oak, finally pulling up to a grand, slightly crumbling manor set among long, wild grass. A chorus of voices erupted as he took out his bags. Children chased each other on the lawn. Older men gathered around a smoking grill, laughing in Welsh and English. Women fussed over platters of food. All eyes turned to him. Oliver. "Ollie, look at you," cried a middle-aged woman, throwing her arms around him with the strength of kin. He was whisked into the fold, bombarded with introductions. Old uncle slapped his back. Cousins he did not remember kissed his cheeks. An elder matriarchal figure, thin and upright, pressed a glass of homemade sloe gin into his hand and declared, "At last, the London sun returns." He wondered at how quickly he was swept in, the stories they recalled, the effortless way they accepted him. "You have your mother's eyes," the matriarch insisted in that curve in the ear. Davies all the way back to Glender. They dined on lamb with mint, fresh bread, leek soup, root vegetables, and trifle. Toast flew thick and fast to the Davies. The old house rang with tangled harmonies and Irish jigs played by someone's grandchild on a battered accordion. As dusk settled, lanterns glowed on the tables outside. Someone called for an old family game, secret stories, where a tale must be told by each in turn. The laughter was loud, warmth, infectious, and yet Oliver felt the faintest coil of discomfort tightening deep within. When it was his turn, he hesitated. "I'm sorry," he laughed. "I do not have stories of the old days. I remember a few things my mother said, but not much else." His new relatives yelled, "Never mind, you belong with us." All that matters is that an old uncle put his arm around Oliver and whispered, "You're home now. We'll remind you." As the night grew darker, the music changed to a more solemn tone. The older family members gathered together and spoke in long, low tones. Women with stern rather than cheerful faces called the children inside for bedtime. The crowd dwindled until only a handful of people were left by the lantern outside. One of the men handed Oliver a glass of dark cider and said softly, "Have you been here before, lad? I would have assumed you had the blood memory of home." Oliver said, his nerves tingling, "No, I don't recall anything at all." "That's odd. You're the spitting image of your great-grandfather." Another cousin, voice thick with something unreadable, nodded. "According to some, a family cannot forget its own. At least our kind always returns." There was a thick silence. There was a shift in the atmosphere. The giggling had stopped. The house behind them, which had been so warm just hours before, now appeared chilly. In the darkness, the windows resembled black mirrors. Oliver's phone buzzed from his pocket. For the first time in his journey, there was no service. The matriarch and the first uncle were the only people who greeted Oliver after the uncles and cousins left one by one, nodding distantly. The wind grew stronger, carrying a keening as old as the land and distant voices. Oliver said, "I plan to drive back in the morning," as the matriarch put her hand on his shoulder. "It's good to have you here finally. There's a lot to keep in mind. You must stay." Oliver was startled to see that there was not a single car left near the gravel drive except for his own. "Nonsense," she said in a gentle yet acerbic tone. "The road is lengthy, and after sunset the hills can be dangerous. You'll remain exactly as you are. With your blood, you belong here." The house had changed inside. In the corners, shadows moved slowly and deliberately. As he went by, portraits appeared to change. He was shown to a top-floor guest room and given a candle. Its bed was covered with thick blankets of wool, and its windows looked out to the moors. There would be no sleep. He paced the creaking floor, looking at the old photos, the faces like his own, all of them staring solemnly. The longer he stared, the more distorted the black and white images became. Whispers ran through the hallway, eyes that seemed too sharp and smiles that were too big. The house itself appeared to breathe at times, a living creature, ancient and vigilant. He heard faint footsteps on the landing at midnight. Oliver listened while pressing himself against the door. Fragmented voices slipped under the threshold, whispering in Welsh. Finally, he's here. The one that the city lost. The circle is complete now. He felt a sudden chill. Oliver slipped down the stairs, being careful not to make a sound because he could no longer stand the stuffy room. He went by rooms with jarred doors. Family members were seated in circles inside, heads bowed, chanting in a dialect he couldn't identify. Desperate for air, he headed for the front hall. The front door opened on its own as he stepped over the threshold. With solemn expressions, the matriarch and uncles stood in anticipation. "Oliver, you're going somewhere." The uncle's voice had lost its friendliness. Their posture, perhaps. Oliver knew there were no more roads to follow because of the darkness outside the door. This ancient house is only reached by winding loops. When he turned to run, cousins were standing in a silent wall behind him, blocking his way. The matriarch whispered, "This is your place." As it was written, "You are Davies. You'll complete the circle." Oliver's thoughts were racing. "I live in London. Work friends. I don't even know you." She gave him a sad, almost affectionate look. "It doesn't matter, kid. We always remember our own. People who go always come back. Family endures forever. This is where you belong." Before the subsequent events could be processed by his frantic mind, they led Oliver back into the dark hallway. He was holding an old book. Around him, chants became louder, and the room whirled. Strange shadows were cast on the walls by the flickering candles. Oliver caught a glimpse of the faces behind the faces. Behind the human features, icy black eyes and sharp teeth shine. Then it got dark. Bathed in sunlight, he woke up in bed. The family was busy making breakfast outside the warm house. Nobody brought up the previous evening. Nobody mentioned whispered circles or old books. There was now a flat tire on his car. There was still no service on the phone. Every escape attempt was subtly and gently foiled. A mechanic is not required. "We'll soon have it fixed. Simply remain a bit longer. The rain from last night has flooded the roads. You appear worn out, my love. Sip on some tea and relax." Weeks turned into months, and days into weeks. Oliver's recollection of his former existence vanished like a steam-written word. He started working in the orchard, helped out with family chores, and was soon recognized by passing villagers who addressed him by name as though he had always been there. He wondered sometimes at night if this had always been his lot. It was a summoning, a return to roots deeper and more powerful than he could have imagined, rather than a family reunion. A visitor to Binmore Hall months later would vouch for seeing a man in the orchard. As though recalling something from a distant world, a man with farmer's hands and Londoner's eyes looked straight through him. Ashley Campbell had always taken pride in her ability to drive confidently on Alberta's highways. She had driven every major route innumerable times as a traveling nurse who served isolated communities throughout the province, learning every turn, landmark, and exit between Calgary and Fort McMurray by heart. She didn't fear the vast expanses of wilderness until the night she got stuck on Highway 63. After finishing a 2-week rotation at an Edmonton clinic, Ashley was heading north to Fort McMurray for her monthly routine in late November 2019. Light snow was predicted, nothing she had never dealt with before. However, the weather unexpectedly deteriorated as she left the city limits. By the time she arrived halfway through her trip, visibility had decreased to just meters in front of her headlights, and a heavy layer of snow was falling steadily. Ashley had made this drive in worse weather, but the radio was crackling with weather warnings telling drivers to stop and wait for things to get better. She slowed down, tightened her hold on the steering wheel, and continued on toward her goal. In the swirling snow, the well-known landmarks started to blend together. The typical truck stops and rest areas appeared to disappear into the storm, and mile markers vanished behind white walls. Ashley discovered that she was depending more and more on her odometer and fuel gauge to monitor her progress. But as the hours passed, an odd thing started to happen. She estimated that she would arrive at Fort McMurray by 1:30 a.m. However, at 11:47 p.m., her dashboard clock steadfastly stayed set, the glowing numbers gleaming mockingly in her cabin's darkness. Thinking it might be frozen, she tapped the screen, but the numbers remained the same. Her fuel gauge was even more disturbing. The needle remained at the 3/4 mark where it had been when she left Edmonton, even after what seemed like hours of highway driving. She knew exactly how much fuel this trip used because she had driven it enough times. Her tank, however, appeared inexplicably impervious to depletion. The first sight that really made her uneasy was Wandering River, a tiny village that she had seen on innumerable occasions before. About 2 hours into her journey, the ancient welcome sign should have appeared, barely visible through the snow. However, she started to notice other familiar sights coming far too soon as she passed the sign and kept heading north. Just as she remembered it, the rusty-roofed red barn that always marked the halfway point of her drive reappeared. Next came the abandoned gas station with the intermittently flickering, broken neon sign, a benchmark by which she consistently assessed her development. However, these locations were showing up at the incorrect times and in the incorrect order, as though the highway itself had lost its sense of its own geography. In an attempt to regain her bearings and possibly weather the storm, Ashley pulled over at what should have been a 24-hour truck stop. However, the building was deserted and dark, with a spotless parking lot covered in snow. There were no footprints or tire tracks, and there was no indication that anyone had been there for hours or even days. The feeling of displacement intensified once they were back on the road. She went past the same red barn, the same deserted gas station, and the same welcome sign for Wandering River once more. As though distance itself had become fluid and unpredictable, the gaps between them appeared to compress and expand at random, but the order remained constant. The lack of signal on her cell phone was not wholly out of the ordinary in this isolated area. Even her CB radio, which she always kept on hand in case of emergencies, however, only generated static. It seemed as though she had driven past the point at which time and space were no longer relevant to any human interaction. Hours went by, or what seemed like hours in a world without clocks. Ashley was caught in a never-ending cycle of familiar sights, each one appearing more eerie than the one before. Every time she passed the red barn, it started to appear more worn. The neon sign at the deserted gas station flashed in various patterns, occasionally spelling out nonsensical words. With unnatural perseverance, the snow kept falling, never getting heavier but never getting lighter. It seemed as though the storm was trapped in a separate area of frozen time, always remaining at the same level of intensity. Ashley's logical mind had a hard time coming up with answers. Maybe she was more confused than she thought from the storm. Perhaps she was traveling in real circles on some intricate system of backroads after taking a wrong turn. However, she secretly knew that there was no rational way to explain her fuel gauge's inexplicable consistency or the impossibility of landmark repetition. Ashley started to notice other unsettling details as the night, if it could still be called night when time had lost all meaning, drew on. The few road signs she saw were getting harder to read. As though written in a language she had previously learned but was now forgetting, their text was hazy and changing. Beyond her headlights, the scenery appeared to have its own life and pulse. Between glimpses, trees seemed to bend and twist into new configurations, as if they were moving when she wasn't looking at them directly. The road itself appeared to gently undulate, rising and falling in ways that were inconsistent with her recollection of this typically straight highway. The occasional glimpses of other vehicles were the most unsettling of all. Occasionally, she would glimpse headlights in her rearview mirror, but they would disappear when she looked straight ahead. At other times, she could make out the dim glow of taillights in the distance ahead of her. However, she never seemed to get any closer to them, regardless of how fast she drove. When she was positive, she noticed a white sedan that was exactly like her own car parked on the shoulder. She slowed to investigate, ready to help what might have been another stranded traveler, but the car just vanished like a mirage, leaving behind nothing but swirling snow and an empty roadside. Ashley started to feel the psychological effects of the never-ending cycle. She started to feel tired, but she was scared to stop driving because she thought she might never be able to move again if she stopped to rest. The journey's repetition started to feel like psychological torture. Every well-known landmark served as a reminder of her increasing captivity. She experimented with a number of tactics to end the pattern. She tried a few different exits, but the roads that led to the off-ramps curved back to the main highway in an impossible way. In an attempt to reset the loop, she briefly tried driving in reverse, but no matter which way she drove, the landmarks kept appearing in the same order. She started singing, then shouting at the deserted landscape, then talking to herself in desperation. She would do anything to keep her sanity, despite the unearthly recurrence. She felt even more alone and isolated as her voice seemed to be lost in the snow-covered air, leaving no echo. Ashley's realization that she had been witnessing the same snowflakes drifting past her windshield was the tipping point. Not merely comparable designs, but the precise same individual flakes, traveling in the same directions under her headlight beam. It wasn't just a persistent storm. Literally, the same storm repeatedly played out over the same few seconds. This insight was accompanied by an odd feeling of acceptance. She could not comprehend or overcome by ordinary means whatever force had held her captive on this unthinkable highway. She had to adopt a new way of thinking in order to tackle the issue from a perspective that recognized the supernatural aspect of her situation. Ashley started to focus more intently on the minute changes in every loop. Tiny details changed, but the main landmarks stayed the same. The position of a far-off light, the number of icicles dangling from a power line, or the angle of a fence post. At first, these variations appeared to be random, but over time she started to see a pattern. The changes seemed to be guiding her to a particular spot, an unmarked dirt road that briefly materialized between the abandoned gas station and the red barn. She had brushed it off as irrelevant in past loops, but now she understood it could hold the secret to her freedom. Ashley headed for the dirt road on what seemed like her 100th ride. She experienced an odd feeling as her wheels lifted off the pavement, as though she were forcing her way through an imperceptible wall. Her dashboard clock lurched forward, going from 11:47 to 11:52 as the snow abruptly stopped falling. In some ways, the dirt road felt more tangible and substantial than the changing scenery of the highway, even though it wound through a thick forest of pine trees with snow-covered branches. Ashley had to carefully navigate the winding path for what seemed like miles before she came out onto a different section of highway, one that she knew was much closer to Fort McMurray than it should have been. As if to make up for lost time, her cell phone signal returned with a barrage of missed calls and anxious messages from friends and coworkers, and her fuel gauge abruptly dropped to almost empty. Her phone indicated that it was 6:30 a.m., almost 7 hours after she had been caught in the loop. Ashley reached Fort McMurray just as the sun was rising, having finished the rest of her journey in a day. She was terrified that people would assume she had experienced some sort of breakdown or hallucination due to the storm and exhaustion, so she never discussed her experience on Highway 63 in public. However, she was aware that what she had gone through was genuine. She had to accept the impossible and look beyond the limits of reason in order to break free from the supernatural loop, which had been as real and unavoidable as any physical prison. Ashley has continued to drive Alberta's highways in the years since that terrifying night, but she has never again seen the red barn, the deserted gas station, or the dirt road that brought her freedom. The entire stretch of supernatural highway appeared to have folded back into the realm from which it originated, leaving only typical asphalt, typical landmarks, and typical time and space rules. However, Ashley occasionally finds herself compulsively checking her dashboard clock during especially strong snowstorms, looking for indications that time may be reversing. And in case she ever has to make another impossible journey through the frozen twilight between worlds, she always keeps her fuel tank full.